Welcome to the Canal Society of New Jersey November meeting. We've got a nice group of folks here in Brookside gathered in person, and we have quite a few people joining us online. So welcome one and all. I'm looking lots of smiling faces here. I see a lot of familiar faces. Do we have any new members or people here for the first time? Okay, your name, sir. Nice to see you again, John. And let's see, anybody else? Bill's friend? Have we seen you before? Okay, welcome once again. And welcome to everybody online. So we're very glad to be here in well, not sunny, but very rural Brookside, New Jersey. And so a little bit of housekeeping. I think the last time we had a meeting in person / online, we had a little trouble with questions. So we're going to take some questions at the end. Those questions that come from the floor, we're going to ask the moderator to repeat the questions so those folks joining us online can hear what's going on. Okay, some news from here in Morris County. Lots and lots of greenway stuff going on. Many of you may have seen our winter ad in Skylands Magazine asking people to come out and explore the Morris Canal Greenway. Those of you who are familiar with Forest Park in Wharton, the lock site renovation there is going gangbusters. They're rebuilding the lock tender's house, and the walls are up and the roof is on, and they're doing work on the lock now, about to reinstall the lock gates, the upper lock gates, and laying in a trench with the utilities that are going to be running out to the site. So that's a wonderful place to go and see what's going on. That will be done. Was promised to be completed by the end of the year, but I'm not sure if that's going to happen quite so quickly. Early in the spring, I think. Plane 2 East in Ledgewood, the renovation, the restoration of the historic landscape there has been delayed. That's going to start in March. So lots and lots of greenway activities going on. Lincoln Park, they've got a new parking lot at Plane 10, and we donated some signage for them to help people find and park and walk on the new trail there. And they're going for a trail grant to expand that trail to be a circular trail up one side of the canal and down the other. So there are lots of stuff going on. And there and in Bhutan, we're working with them to conserve the Arch Bridge, the Greenway Trail across the railroad trestle is going to happen. That's actually in construction documents. And so, and we're providing some more signage for them this year. We funded a trailhead in Grace Lord Park last year, and we'll have a second trailhead in the at the Ironworks site and some additional signage. Bill McKelvey, you have your hand up. Absolutely gone. Bill McKelvey's group was interested in acquiring a building on that Ironworks property a while ago, but that project would not work. And now the building is going to be completely removed, gone. Well, that's a longer story than we can tell here. In Warren County, folks who walk the Waterloo Valley Trail will be happy to know that the trail is now open again. The bridge just north of Bilby Road is finally in place, and I guess a bit of a tornado tore through there and dumped a lot of trees on the trail, and even that's been cleared away. So a great fall hike might be to start at Bilby Road and walk the Waterloo Valley Trail. Events coming up in 2022. Hopefully, we're going to be having our first meeting here in January. We're planning a spring, an early spring, a symposium, trying to get back to normal these days. And we'll be at Waterloo with a Waterloo Canal Day in June, and doing interpretation and programming in U Forest Park at the lock site when that comes back together again. One thing that we would like to do next year is to try to get back to normal. We're finding that lots of people are interested in joining us here online. And that's very good in some ways. Lots of people from out of town, people who've never been able to join us for meetings before, are able to attend. But we also kind of miss our in-person meetings and our gatherings with lots of food and lots of socialization. And we would like to know from you members if you would like to start doing that again next year. We'll be reaching out to you in the new year to find out what you would like, either here in Brookside or at our former location at the Cultural Center. It depends on whether that's going to be available or not. So we'd like to know if folks would turn out for in-person meetings once again. Let's see what else we got here. Okay. Volunteers. We're going to be doing our regular programming at Waterloo this coming season, and we're also going to be doing programming at the lock site at Wharton. So we're going to need more volunteers. In the next year, Bobby Egan is going to be reaching out to many of you online, and hopefully when she calls, you'll consider joining us. We don't need heroes. We just need people to give some time now and then when they can, to come and greet visitors and interpret our historic sites. And those who have joined us have a great time. And so I would encourage you all to join us potentially in the new year and join our activities. Tonight's program, we're going to have Martha Capwell Fox, and she's going to be talking about the Lehigh Crane Ironworks in Pennsylvania. And so this is an iron talk, but I'll remind you guys that not everything is all about canals. And I know that's a surprise to many of you guys, and me too. But I was interested in iron a long time before I got interested in canals. And the truth of it is that the Morris Canal spent a lot of its time taking good magnetite iron ore from New Jersey west to Pennsylvania. So this is really part of our story too. So Martha is the historian and archive coordinator at the National Canal Museum and the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor. And she's got a great story for us to tell. So I'm going to turn it over to her. Martha.
Okay, thank you. I'm really happy to be back with this group. The last time I did was at the other place that was so incredibly hard to find. So, and so I made the point of coming out today in daylight, and I found here without any trouble. Joe is right. I'm going to talk about the relationship basically between the iron industry in Eastern Pennsylvania. And I'm really going to spend just about as much time, and it was new to me, I have to admit, in many cases, the iron industry in the 19th century in New Jersey as well. One of the things that I wanted to use and brag about a little bit here is this particular image, which currently is on display in the National Canal Museum. We have an art exhibit that celebrates the 50th anniversary of the museum. And it's called Where Creativity Flows, 200 years of art inspired by our canals. And this painting, which in fact belongs to the Siegel Museum in Easton, is what got it all started. This is one of my favorite paintings. And when I found out that the Siegel had it, I begged and begged, and in fact, I didn't really have to beg much at all. They were very happy to lend it. It's very large. Oops, did I just step on something? Turn something? Oh. And this was painted by the Moravian landscape artist Gustav Grunewald. Oh, okay, all right. Okay, wonderful. Wonderful. As I started to say, this is a wonderful painting that really illustrates the links between Eastern Pennsylvania and Northwestern New Jersey. This is one of my absolute favorite paintings. And when the Siegel Museum offered to lend it to us for the current exhibit, I was overjoyed. I started out with wanting it simply because it shows the Morris Canal coming down from the entrance and a little sliver of the Delaware Canal on the other side. But here, this was painted in 1856 or 57. So here is the Lehigh Valley Railroad Bridge, and beyond the covered bridge that went between Easton and Phillipsburg, there's a roundhouse over here on the Peaburg side. One of the things I would point out to you, because this is really relevant to our story, is you will notice the almost complete absence of trees. And that was part of the story of developing the anthracite iron business, was the complete dearth of trees, which basically wiped out the charcoal iron industry in both states about 50 years before this painting was actually done. Can I have the next slide, please? Whoever is handling, like, next slide. Next. Next. Okay. Well, we can admire this a little bit longer. By the way, if you went up on the promontory in Williams Township where that was painted, you wouldn't be able to see that view, which actually looks up toward Wind Gap and the Delaware Water Gap, because now there's trees in the way again. So this story of all of this development actually begins in the coal regions in Pennsylvania. Anthracite is not found in too many places in the world, and the coal regions of northeastern Pennsylvania are the largest and richest deposit of anthracite anywhere in the world. The original one that was exploited was the southern one. Here is the town of Mock Chunk, Jim Thorpe here at the end, Summit Hill. This is known as the Panther Valley. They were among the earliest mines that were exploited. And that's the part of our story that I'm going to get into. Just for reference, and then here is the Lehigh River, Lehigh County, Carbon County. Next one, next slide, please. In 1792, there's lots of variation on this story, but the generally accepted one is that a man named Philip Ginder was hunting and or possibly looking for a grindstone, although how he was going to get it to his grist mill from all the way up on the top of Sharp Mountain is kind of a good question. In any case, in 1792, Philip Ginder accidentally discovered anthracite coal right on the surface of the ground on the top of Sharp Mountain. This is currently the site of the town of Summit Hill. It's about 9 miles west of the town of Jim Thorpe, of course, formerly Mock Chunk. And in 1793, the original Lehigh Coal Company started to open a mine up there on the top of Sharp Mountain. The coal was so abundant. This is actually part of what's known as the Mammoth Vein. The coal was so abundant that basically all they had to do was scrape off the overburden and start quarrying it. So this was the original coal mine. Mining it was not the problem. It was pretty easy to get out of the ground. The problem was getting it to some place where there were enough people to buy it. And that was the major issue, because Summit Hill is approximately 110 miles as the crow flies north of Philadelphia. There were next to no roads between those two places. There were very, very few people, basically, between the area that's now Carbon County and the area around Philadelphia. Philadelphia was actually the largest city in North America at that point. So if you were going to sell anything, you wanted to get it to Philadelphia. So they started to try to deliver coal by wagon. And considering that the wagons of the time could only carry about 2 tons at the most, and it was a very long, slow, torturous trip down to Philadelphia, The short version of the story is that everybody that tried to work this mine between 1792 and about 1805 lost their shirts. It was the transportation issue that really did them in. There was also another problem, is that the coal that got to Philadelphia, nobody really knew what to do with, because anthracite is really, really hard. It's one of the things that makes it a really good fuel from an energy delivery standpoint. Anthracite is really hard. It's very hard to get it to light. And so people didn't really know what to do with it. Plus the fact that at the time, nobody was really terribly worried about running out of fuel, although they didn't know what was coming in the next decade or so. So anthracite got next to no market acceptance in Philadelphia. And a succession of companies, starting with the one that was founded by Jacob Weiss and some other Moravian investors, went bust. The family of Jacob Sist from the Wilkes-Barre area also attempted to exploit this, but again ran into the issue of the transportation cost. So the mine was abandoned multiple times. But what happened in the meantime was that beginning in about the early 1800s, Eastern Pennsylvania, and actually this part of New Jersey as well, began to have an energy crisis. We think of that as a 20th century problem, but actually the very first one happened in the early 19th century, and the energy that was lacking was wood. 150 years worth of European settlement had basically stripped the easily accessible forests on the Atlantic coast of the United States. And so wood was becoming very scarce and very expensive. So places like Philadelphia began to turn to bituminous coal, which came from two sources. One source was the mountains of Virginia. That was really soft bituminous coal. And it came down from the headwaters of the James River on bateaus, as they were called, down the James River, down the Chesapeake, around the eastern shore of Maryland, up through Delaware Bay, and delivered to Philadelphia. The other source of it was being used as ballast in British ships, because the United States, the United States' biggest trading partner in the early 19th century was Great Britain. So they were getting used to using coal, but it was really nasty, dirty, smoky stuff, but at least it was coal and it was fuel and it was available. That whole thing came to a screeching halt in 1812 when the United States went to war with Britain. And the British Navy promptly blockaded the coast of the United States, and that was the end of Virginia coal as well as British coal. So at the same time, can I have a next slide, please? These two gentlemen, Josiah White on the left and Erskine Hazard on the right, picked the very worst year possible to go into the business of making nails and wire on the banks of the Schuylkill River. Because if you're going to draw wire or cut nails, you need to be able to soften the iron enough to work on it. And they needed fuel. So somewhere along the line in 1812, 1813, they actually purchased a load of anthracite that was still making its way once in a while down to Philadelphia. And the story goes, and we know this from both of their diaries, bless them, they were good diarists and great letter writers. This is probably Josiah White really being the authority here. They put the coal in the furnace that they were using to soften their metal in the factory, and they couldn't get it to light. They tinkered with it all day and they could not get it to light. So they gave up, they shut the furnace, and everybody went home. A few hours later, one of their workmen remembered that he had left his jacket in the factory, and he went back to get it. It was in like November or something, cold weather anyway. When he opened the door of the building, it was warm. And when he went inside and looked at the furnace was red hot. And it turned out that what they had accidentally discovered is the way you burn anthracite is you put it in a closed furnace and you give it an updraft of air, oxygen, basically. And then you get a nice, hot, long-lasting fire. In fact, to the point that this man summoned White. Nobody's saying how this actually happened. And White summoned the rest of his workforce. And overnight, they did a day's worth of work on that one load of anthracite. So they then realized that this was certainly viable as a large scale industrial fuel. Up to that point, it had been used sporadically around northeastern Pennsylvania by blacksmiths, but never on a large scale manufacturing program. But between the war and a few other things that they got involved with and then got booted out of, like trying to canalize the Schuylkill River, White and Hazard ultimately in 1818 first leased and then bought outright that mine in Summit Hill. Can I have the next slide, please? And by 1820, they had completed a series of 13 dams on the Lehigh River. There's a story about them having the Lehigh River. In 1818, when they formed the Lehigh Navigation Company and the Lehigh Coal Company, they realized that everybody who had lost their shirt to that point lost it on the transportation issue, not on the getting coal out of the ground issue. So White, both of them were very, very creative and intelligent men, and White was really an inventor. And so White and a German fake nobleman, which is a whole other story there, went to the legislature in Harrisburg, and they said, look, if we can get this coal out of the mines way up there in the back of beyond and get it down to market where it can be used, it's going to be good for the United States. It's going to be good for Pennsylvania. It's going to be good for us. They didn't really say that probably out loud, because most educated Americans by this point, in the late 18 teens, were beginning to recognize that the United States was lagging very, very, very badly behind the industrial technology that was in Britain and was getting more and more prevalent on the rest of the European continent. So they said, well, you know what? We figured out a way to tame the transportation issue. And it was this. This was called the Bear Trap Dam. And they constructed 13 of these on the Lehigh. And they did this because when they went to the legislature and gave them this song and dance about anthracite and the United States' future and all that sort of thing, the legislature said, sure, take the river, take the water rights, take the islands, take the tributaries, take the land on both sides of the river. We'll get it back. Nobody makes any money in this cockamamie coal business. Pennsylvania got the river back in 1966. And actually, it was the water rights that proved to be the thing that kept the company going after the coal business went bust. But in any case, now they were in possession of a river and its water power. And White had devised a system with this bear trap, which is basically a hydrostatic dam with a gate at one side held up vertically by water power. And when the water is shut off, the gate falls. The water that's built up behind the dam shoots through there. And that made it possible to carry boxes of coal, basically. You can see it in here. This is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 boxes of coal, each one about 8 feet square and about 2 feet deep, chained together. Guy on the front with a fending pole, guy on the back with a sweep oar. And they managed to get those all the way down the river, 46 miles to Easton, and then all the way down the Delaware, and delivered by 1820, 28,000 tons of coal that was coming down the stone road from the mine in Summit Hill. And people in Philadelphia loved it. It made a hot fire. It lasted a long time. It heated the house really well. There were big buildings in Philadelphia, hospitals, Independence Hall, places like that. They sold every piece of coal as fast as they could get it to Philadelphia. So that was really the establishment of a successful anthracite process. Can I have the next? And they then decided, well, they recognized actually that this one-way navigation was not actually economically sustainable because, for one thing, that business about the wood shortage, all those boxes that they were making were going to Philadelphia and they were not coming back. So they were reaching further and further into lands that they had already bought surrounding what's now known as Lehigh Gorge. And they were actually beginning to go through the lumber up there pretty rapidly too. So in 1827, which was 2 years after the completion of the Erie Canal, There was sufficient understanding of how to engineer canals now in the United States. So Lehigh Navigation engaged Canvas White, who was a young engineer who had worked on the Erie Canal, and he engineered the two-way canal. And at the same time, Josiah White oversaw the construction of what was originally the gravity railroad and eventually became known as the switchback. And that made it much, much more efficient to move major amounts of coal down from the mine at Summit Hill and to deliver it to the boats on the river. Now, this painting was made in 1832 by a Swiss painter, and he was visiting with a prince from Germany who had come to North America to study the Indians. But they spent part of their time after they got here touring around the Northeast United States. And so this is an eyewitness view of what the Gravity Railroad and Mach Chunk looked like in 1832. And one of the things that is very interesting is that these appear to be Durham boats. So even though the two-way navigation was already completed and was built from the get-go to accommodate boats that could carry 100 tons of coal, would be 10.5 feet wide, roughly 90 feet long. The locks and the whole canal were constructed from the very beginning to handle a boat that size. But apparently in 1832, they were still using Durham boats, probably partly so that they didn't have to transship the coal when they got to the Delaware River in Easton, and they could just send it right down to Philadelphia on the Durham boats. Be that as it may, this was, by this point, was a really flourishing anthracite trade, and anthracite was rapidly becoming the fuel of choice for a lot of domestic use, but at this point, not really iron making. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, here's the Lehigh Navigation. Lots of locks because it's 450 some feet change in elevation from Mach Chunk down to Easton. So this was an enormous undertaking in terms of canal construction. But the amazing thing is that this 46 miles, which was originally 49 locks, 49 lock tenders houses, 9 dams, no inclines. We didn't have any inclines on the Lehigh Navigation. This was completed by approximately 1,000 men in 2.5 years, ahead of schedule and under budget. It cost $1 million in 1820s money, but it was completed in less than 30 months when you consider that they couldn't work in the dead of winter. One time when I was doing this talk on our canal boat in Humor Park, I mentioned this and I compared it unfavorably with the 5+ years that it took to construct 5 miles, less than 5 miles of Route 412 between the casino and Route 78. And there was a lady from PennDOT on the boat, and she was not happy with me. I said, hey, it's historic fact. But it was a very complex project. I said, so was this. In any case, it was completed, and it was a very successful and efficient transportation system. And it really was part of what kicked off the real canal mania, especially in the Middle Atlantic states. So can I have the next slide, please? But before we get to the rest of the canals for a moment, I have to show you the 2 great examples on the Pennsylvania side of the result of making the canals and making them into an efficient way to transport not only anthracite coal, but also a lot of heavy, bulky products. Remember, I mentioned that educated people in this country were painfully aware of the fact that we were badly behind Britain in terms of industry. And in those days, industry meant producing iron in an efficient manner and producing a good, useful product in fairly large quantities. This was not possible in charcoal-fired furnaces in this country, even when hardwood was abundant and easily accessible. Just because it took an acre of hardwood trees and about 4 months worth of preparation to make enough charcoal to make a ton of iron. Now, a ton sounds like a lot until you start making cannonballs out of it and things like that. So the charcoal industry was hampered from the get-go by a combination of productivity issues and also the difficulties of getting both all the raw materials. Meanwhile, in Britain, they had been using coal since 1718, to smelt iron. And that led to all sorts of other modern day inventions like steam engines and things like that, and was turning Britain rapidly into an industrial power. Meanwhile, as late as 1820 and even the 1830s, the United States was still basically an agricultural and slightly a mercantile society and economy. So people started to try to play with anthracite to smelt iron. The problem was, at least on the Pennsylvania side, which is the part I know about, was that nobody knew how to build an iron furnace that could contain the heat that anthracite can generate. And so they blew up a lot of furnaces all over the place. White and Hazard blew up a furnace up near Mock Chunk because they couldn't control the heat that the anthracite was putting out. Finally, in 1837, Josiah White's nephew was investigating tram railways in Wales, and he happened to visit an ironworks in a town called Inniskedwin. And at Inniskedwin, the man who owned the furnace, named George Crane, and his ironmaster, David Thomas, had basically perfected using anthracite coal. There was a small seam of anthracite near the Inniskedwin works, and they had combined it with the hot blast, which Crane had bought the patent rights to the hot blast system. And they were turning out large quantities of really high quality iron. So White's nephew wrote to his uncle, and Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company sent Erskine Hazard and his son Alexander to Wales in the fall of 1838 to visit Inniskedwin. And at that point, it looked like they were trying to just get the patent rights for this process. But when Hazard got there, he realized that what they needed was to have somebody come to Pennsylvania and do it for them. So between him and David Thomas's wife, they persuaded Thomas to come to Pennsylvania, which he did in June of 1839. They plopped him down on a farmer's field alongside Lock 36, which was nowhere in those days and is now what's left of it in Catasauqua. And they chose that because the water power in that part of the canal was strong enough, because Thomas was going to need an enormous water wheel to power his blowing engines. He must have felt like he'd been shoved backwards in history, because he had been using nothing but steam engines to power his blowing machines. But in the United States, we couldn't make steam engines big enough to put that much push behind it because we didn't make enough iron. And so he had to build this 12-foot in diameter, 24-foot water wheel to power his blowing engines. The short version of the story is that he broke ground in August of 1839. He put the furnace into blast on the 3rd of July, 1840. And on the 4th of July, 1840, he produced more iron in one day than a charcoal-fired furnace could make in a week. And that was really the beginning of the American Industrial Revolution. It was the first time that anybody anywhere in the United States was able to consistently produce large quantities of very high quality iron in a very, very short time. So news of this spread rather rapidly. And within a year or so, can I have the next slide, please? A bunch of investors in Boston hired an English ironmaster named William Firmstone. And they told him to find another good site in Pennsylvania and build another anthracite-fired furnace. And Firmstone, for some reason, kind of wandered around the state for a little while, but he kept consulting with Thomas, and Thomas was consulting with a lot of other iron makers, too, in Pennsylvania. And Thomas said to him, stick with Lehigh Coal and Navigation. You can get the water power that you need for your blast furnaces. You've got the delivery system right at your front door with coal coming in and iron ore coming in. You're going to have to find some way to haul limestone in. And that's exactly what happened. It took Firmstone 2 years to build the Glendon Ironworks. And this was what it looked like in the 1880s. In fact, this is what Humor Park looked like in the 1880s, because this is in Humor Park. There's a few ruins left here and there, but there's really nothing too easily identifiable or interpretable. But we like to say at the DNL that this picture shows the corridor in microcosm, because here we have the canal and a loaded coal boat and an empty one, pile of coal, an ironworks dependent entirely on the coal. Actually, I shouldn't claim this is coal. This could very well be New Jersey magnetite, because the Glendon Ironworks adopted using New Jersey magnetite very, very early in its operation. And then this is the Lehigh Valley Railroad, which came along in 1854. So by the time of the Civil War, on the Pennsylvania side, because of the canals, not just the Lehigh and the Delaware, but also the Schuylkill and the Delaware and Hudson, Eastern Pennsylvania was the leading iron producer in the entire United States. And it was because of the canal system, even though it was suppressed, it was superseded rather, in terms of coal delivery by the railroads, but really not until after the Civil War. And this entire integrated system of being able to haul in the raw materials cheaply and in large quantity, and then carry away the finished product, which in these cases was pig iron, was entirely due to the canals. And so hence, when Lance Metz kind of put all of that together in his head, that basically became the genesis of the collection we now have at the National Canal Museum, and also eventually led to the formation of the Heritage Corridor. So, can I have the next slide, please? Very briefly, here's the example of using water power. This is what was known as the Abbott Street area in South Easton. It was along Lock 47, which if you come to the park and you hike your way down into the lower end of the eastern end of the park, Lock 47 is still there. All of these businesses, which at one point included this building here, which was a cotton mill, which was actually built before the canal was actually open for operations, and was entirely water powered. And also what was at one point the largest barbed wire company in the United States, and any number of other industries that came and went between the late 1820s and 1900 existed down on this part of the canal, and they were entirely powered by water. In fact, so much so that a lot of them went out of business because they never installed steam engines, and they got to the point where they couldn't compete. This area was so busy, there was actually a towpath on either side of the canal as well. Next slide, please. Okay, Easton is the only place in the United States where 3 canals came together, 3 canals owned by 3 different companies. I had an argument with somebody about Northumberland, Pennsylvania once. But the Lehigh Navigation, the Delaware Division of the Pennsylvania Canal, and the Morris Canal came together in Easton at the forks of the Delaware. Now, this painting, it was done by Mary McCartney, who was the wife of a judge in Northampton County and a professor at Lafayette. And she painted about 15 of these watercolors in the 1830s and early 1840s. They also belong to the Siegel Museum. And this is also in our exhibit. And they're remarkable because this was long before photography. So this is virtually the only visual record that there is of what Easton and the river looked like in this is dated 1841. So here we have the end of the dam at the mouth of the Lehigh, the entrance to the Delaware Canal over here. Here is the outlet lock that let boats come across the Delaware and go into the entrance to the Morris. And so here you can see the incline, which is still sort of there underneath the trestles, and then the canal, as we saw in the Grunewald painting, skirting, I can't remember, it's Mount Ida on the Pennsylvania side. I can't remember what it's called on the Jersey side. Parnassus, thank you, because there is a Parnassus picture as well of Mary McCartney's. So I was totally astounded when they lent us these, because these are really precious to the Northampton County Historical and Genealogical Society, to the point where every 3 months they bring out 3 different ones and all their membership comes in to look at them again. So next one, please. This is a C.P. Yoder. He was one of the founders of the Pennsylvania Canal Society, kind of impression of the same area, but later the cable ferry. Is this thing going anymore? Oh yes, there it is. The cable ferry is visible there. The incline, incline and the entrance, not quite so much, but the entrance to the Delaware Canal. And of course, these locks are still there. The dam and everything are all different, and there is, of course, no outlet out into the Delaware to come over to the Jersey side. Next one, please. And this is what this looked like from the New Jersey side in 1860. This is the etching that's in Henry's History of the Lehigh Valley from 1860, and here in the foreground, we see the Morris Canal. Now, the Morris was possibly even a bigger rescuer of the economy as it actually existed here in New Jersey, because although there was a small iron industry on the Pennsylvania side, in this post-Revolutionary War period, there was a tremendous amount of iron making in the New Jersey highlands. As a matter of fact, it's known that there were 12 furnaces and 81 forges in the areas of what's now Sussex County, Warren County, Morris County, and even, I guess, Upper Passaic County as well. What happened, however, was that the dearth of charcoal, of the availability of charcoal, actually ruined most of them, so that by 1820, there were only, of the 12 furnaces, 9 had failed, and the other 3 were in pretty bad shape. And 30 of the forges were also closed down and in ruins, and the rest of them were in very poor shape. In fact, the iron industry in general was very, very dull, as they used to say, at that time, because of the absence of fuel. The trouble with the Jersey side as well was that the highland areas were pretty isolated. And so with the absence of a decent transportation system, not only was this impacting their iron business, but also their agricultural business. And the population up there wasn't big enough to consume everything that could potentially be sold. And so the population actually began to drop in that area of New Jersey. Now, then it occurred to me, okay, if there were this many furnaces in New Jersey in that period between 1780 and 1820, what did the Lehigh Valley look like? Well, there were 4 furnaces in the whole Lehigh Valley. One of them was Durham, which actually had been founded in 1728, and actually went out of business before 1800, again, because of the absence of charcoal, among other things. Then there was the Hampton furnace, which I think you visited, whoever went on the SIA, which was begun in 1809. That was in way southwestern Lehigh County. The Moravian, the Henry family, who founded the gunmaking business outside of Nazareth, built the Catherine furnace in 1825. And the following year, Lehigh furnace, which was on the side of the mountain facing southward a little bit west of Lehigh Gap, was built the following year. And as charcoal furnaces go, that one lasted a really, really long time. But the rest of them didn't last very long, and basically didn't make the transition into anthracite. So having the Morris Canal come through, being able to not only deliver anthracite coal to iron furnaces, which became the standard for efficient fuel, but it also created an entirely new industry in terms of mining iron on a very large scale. So that the movement westward of the magnetite was really what made the Morris the most successful thing, because they could make money going both ways. they could make money carrying anthracite eastward and magnetite westward, because Pennsylvania's hematite was not really capable of making the broad variety of iron that the industry began to demand. And like I said, Glendon used magnetite almost from the get-go. And even David Thomas was mixing magnetite into the iron that he was making in Catasauqua. So the Morris never had a problem where they were sending back empty boats, because there was always something to ship. In fact, one of the things that I read, and I'm not sure, it flies in the face of what we say about anthracite going on the Morris all the way to New York, is I read something that said virtually all of the anthracite didn't get past Bhutan. So I don't know if that's true or not. What we have, at least in our library, is not the best history, I would say. And I really, really would urge you folks to lean on a few academic historians here in New Jersey to study this, because really, although, you know, Connecticut has the reputation of being the workshop of the United States, in the 19th century, particularly in the mid-19th century, the real heart of American industry was here in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey. One of the wonderful statistics that I ran across in 100 years, 100 miles, is that she says that between 1845 and 1889, 82,028,663 tons of magnetite were shipped westward on the Morris Canal. And that's really an amazing figure, because it really spurred a tremendous amount of industry, even to the point where I only know this because I helped with the John Fritz exhibit at the National Museum of Industrial History. Bethlehem Iron was importing it as well, particularly when John Fritz was trying to get them into making steel, because there were certain types of magnetite that were far superior to anything that could be iron ore that could be mined locally in Pennsylvania for making steel. So, in any case, this spurred an awful lot of foundries on the New Jersey side. And one of the first, and there's a bunch of names that keep coming up all the time on the New Jersey side, and two of them are Cooper and Hewitt. Can I have the next one, please? Well, here is actually a little map that is in the Port Orum book that was written in the 70s, I believe. And it's kind of primitive, but on the other hand, it's a really, really clear map. And so it does give you an idea of how much of the iron industry was spurred along by being right here on the Morris Canal. So Andover was one of the first stops. Now, can I have the next one, please? And this one kind of makes a lot of sense, because bingo, I mean, there's the Morris Canal in the foreground, the Delaware River in the background, and Pennsylvania on the other side. In 1847, Cooper and Hewitt bought 40 acres, and they chose this location specifically because they could get their iron ore on the Morris, they could get their anthracite from just across the river on the Lehigh, and they could haul their iron across the river, get it into the Delaware, and that was how they got it to Trenton, because every place that they made iron was with the aim of actually getting the iron to their works in Trenton, where they made some of the first building columns that were ever constructed in the United States. So the Andover furnace was very profitable and very successful pretty much from the get-go. By 1855, they were making 25,000 tons of iron a year with it, and they were employing almost 700 men. It was probably at the height of its productivity right before the Civil War, the most productive ironworks in the United States. In 1867, it was bought by Ario Pardee, who is another name who turns up continuously. And this was news to me because I only knew about Pardee and the Hazelton coal and everything like that. But he was another one of those people who had his hands on a lot of things. And Pardee bought it in 1867, renamed it the Andover Iron Company. And he leased it for a while, and it changed hands a few more times. Actually, in the this one still was in existence in the early 1900s when it was bought by Joseph Wharton, the other big name, of course, in the iron industry, particularly here over in Jersey. But it only lasted another 10 years. This was just really part of the whole story with basically the pig iron business, because it was being supplanted by steel. And also the entire metallurgic industry was moving to Western Pennsylvania and to the area around the Great Lakes, after good ores were also discovered around Lake Superior. And so the combination of the industry moving and a succession of really bad economic conditions that happened in the 1870s and again in the 1890s. This pattern repeats over and over. This is basically what did in almost the entire merchant pig industry in the whole area. It was shut down. Andover, can I have the next slide, please? These are all actually early 20th century pictures as well. Here, the Delaware, rather, I'm sorry, is on the left. The canal's visible on the right. This was shut down in 1910. In 1912, the Pennsylvania Railroad bought the site so that they could expand the Belldale Yard further south, and they started to demolish it. It was entirely demolished by 1917, although the office building apparently stood sometime into the 80s, and now there is a school in Phillipsburg called the Andover Morris School on top of it. So going to the other end of the Morris iron industry, next please, is a handful of pictures that we had, that were what I could tap, of Bhutan. This is a picture that's from the with the nail makers, and it's got a fold in the middle of it, which is beyond my Photoshop capabilities to erase. Yes, I was also intrigued by the fact that it says it was a wax paper negative, and this is a very, very early picture. Ah, okay. Oh, Kodak can be expensive to get stuff from. Oh. Uh-huh. Okay. You know, I don't think we have that because I don't remember seeing. Thank you. Yeah, it's really important. This is something that Lance was a lot more than I am, but I thought this was a remarkable picture. And this was, of course, the subject of those two Harper's articles that are really, really the best description of the working life of people who were in this industry in the 1850s. The next picture, I believe it is, oh no, this is the engraving from the Harper's article of the casting house and the furnace beyond it. And then the next picture illustrates an amazing story about how they dumped the slag down into a ravine. We're very careful not to let it go in the river with the rockaway. But yeah, think of things you couldn't do today. I've never heard of any place where it was dumped in what amounted to a cascade. So I thought that this was really remarkable. Now, the other thing about Bhutan is that they basically produced iron just for their own purposes of the other products that they made there, nails and other things. And all of that business persisted even after the the pig iron industry became really obsolete. One of the things that really intrigued me also about Bhutan, and again, here's this Pennsylvania, New Jersey connection, is that Samuel Thomas, who was David Thomas's son, actually built the first anthracite furnace at Bhutan in 1848. Now, he was only 22 at that point, but he had grown up in the business, obviously, and so he really knew what he was doing. He didn't stay very long, though, because then he went to Hakkendakwa to build the Thomas Iron Works. This was a really profitable operation. I think there's one more picture of Boonton here. Yes, a really profitable operation until the Panic of 1873. This is one of the other things that did in a ton of businesses of all sort, including it really decimated the pig iron business in the Lehigh Valley as well. But it persisted for a long time afterward, just in the process of some of the other things that they were making. And I was also intrigued by a mention in an 1882 history of Morris County that there was already a silk mill in Boonton. And that was one of the things that kind of cushioned the blow because the silk industry was beginning to move out of Patterson. And even if the guys were losing their jobs, the women then had work. Port Orum, aka Wharton, was another early one. This is one that I could not find any pictures in our collection that we had of anything in Port Orum. And this was actually the longest success story because Joseph Wharton got in there. And the Port Orum book is frustrating, though, because the chapter that talks about the beginnings of the iron industry then talks about how it totally collapsed and Wharton came in and he was terribly important, so important that they named the town after him later. And then it goes into this paragraph about the iron industry collapsing. And then fortunately, I found the chapter towards the back that talks about the later years, and Wharton really invested a tremendous amount of money, built 3 modern anthracite furnaces and an awful lot of other businesses, and that was consequently why they named the town after him later on. And now you've got a wonderful project going on in Wharton, so that should be drawing a lot more people. Wharton was another one of those places, Port Orum rather, was another one of those places where Pardee was briefly involved as well, but he didn't stick with that too terribly long. The thing about that happened that's sort of sad, though, is that Joseph Wharton died in 1909. The industry was actually still doing pretty well. There were places where it was still doing fairly well because the anthracite iron industry had contracted to the point where the few people who were left had enough business. One of them was the Crane Ironworks, actually. But Wharton died in 1909, and in 1911, his heirs sold off the property and closed the furnaces and tore it down. And so I gather there's not even anything to see there at all. Wharton did? Okay, well, that's not what the guy that wrote the Port Orum book says. Okay. It was still Replogle. Well, and then Replogle was bought by Warren Pipe, though, almost immediately, because they also bought the Empire Steel and Iron Company. And then it was Warren that actually demolished the Crane Works, for one thing. But I didn't realize that they also kept that going. Okay. Yeah, we don't have any Jersey Sanborns. Yeah, I know they are. Yeah, I know Penn State's got a lot of them too. So that's really interesting. So, okay, I think the next couple of pictures are, oh yes, this is also, I kept this one because although it's, the Union Foundry, but here it is also still alongside the canal. Apparently a lot of places here in New Jersey were using water power too, right up to just about the end. So, okay, that was just a postcard I found in our collection. Next one, please. Oxford. This is one of the ones that's pretty parallel to the story of Durham furnace. Having been started in the 18th century, producing armaments, cannonballs, or other ordnance for the Revolutionary War. The remarkable thing to me about this is that this is still the picture. The building on the left there is the original charcoal furnace that was still standing, even though Oxford shut down the first time in 1809, and it sat completely idle until 1832. And then when it was reopened by, among other people, one of the Scranton brothers, and it was greatly expanded. I'm also intrigued by the fact that the building next to it became a church. It was a grist mill at the time, and it became a church. So in the 1840s, Selden Scranton, who had been running it in the from 1832, it was actually leased to William Henry, the gunmaker, but he didn't want to remove himself from another place that he was trying to build a furnace in Pennsylvania. And so he hired this Selden Scranton to get it running. But they rebuilt it. And they actually were the first place where a hot blast was used in 1835, the first documented use of hot blast in the United States, at least in 1835. Hot blast was known. I guess they just were not real particular about patent rights or anything like that, because Lehigh Navigation actually owned the patent rights, but that wasn't until later on. It seems, is the church still there? Because I saw some pictures that seem later. It is still there. Okay. That's amazing, because this is, and the furnace, what's left of the furnace was stabilized, and it's still standing too. Later on, another Scranton, a younger Scranton, built a furnace in the 1840s, and that was the first one that was run by anthracite. And then in 1859, Selden returned, and he ran it until the place went bankrupt in 1873. And eventually, all the anthracite furnaces were torn down, but this original one was still left. In fact, the charcoal furnace wasn't even blown out until 1873. So this has got to be one of the longest lasting of the Oxford furnaces. I think there's a few more pictures with this. Yes, this is after it was then bought by who was it that bought this one? This wasn't the Thomases. Oh, no, this is the one that was bought in 1900 by Empire Steel and Iron. I should have remembered that. They were Catasauqua. And there was a lot of renovation that was done. Leonard Peckett was really big on improving stoves. As a matter of fact, in Catasauqua, they demolished the entire complex in 1919, completely rebuilt it, put it into blast in 1921, and blew it out in 1922. So Oxford actually lasted not even quite that long. Although actually they remained contemporary with Empire, and when Empire basically shut down in 1921 and was bought by Replogle and then Warren. It was also that all of their property, which was really extensive, was not only furnaces in several states, but also there was heavy duty interest in owning the iron mines that were around here. I think there's one more picture of Oxford, or two maybe, again, also about 1910. This is unfortunately the only picture I found that has people in it. And this is a crew that worked at the ore heaters, which they had at the roaster, rather, yeah. Heater is what they do to cement. And there's another picture right after this one, I believe, that shows the whole line of them. Oh, this one struck me because I've looked at an awful lot of steel pictures and iron pictures, and this skip, this is the best picture of an early 20th century skip I have ever seen. So that's just from a technical standpoint, and it's also pretty. I mean, it's a very striking picture. Anyway, next one. These are two pictures out of three. The third one's really not very good. that we were recently given by some people who live near Oxford. I can't think of their name right offhand, which is terrible. But that shows the roasters and also this little narrow gauge railroad that was there. And these pictures are dated 1921. I don't know anything more about them than that, though. And they also came with some pictures of the building of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, the cut, you know. But yeah, yes. So I haven't had much chance to do any processing of that sort of stuff. Okay, now, but as far as the mines go, I mean, of course, that was really the sustaining industry was the iron mining, particularly for the magnetite. These are unfortunately two of the only three pictures we have, and this is all Mount Hope. Little by little, an awful lot of the Pennsylvania firms owned the iron mines. Glendon owned one, and the Thomas Iron Company owned the Richard mines. Glendon owned the Tebow mines. And as those companies went down in Pennsylvania, the iron mines either in some cases closed or in other cases just simply changed hands. Mount Hope, as you know, was actually still running until, some of it was still running until 1966. I was astounded too to read, because there's a lot of description of them, just not a lot of pictures, how deep those mines were. They were far deeper than most anthracite mines. And that's really remarkable, which is why, to me, it's a shame that there may be better pictures someplace, but we don't have them. So no, that's just astounding. So that's basically where I am at the end of this. And I just think that this is really a fascinating story. I certainly learned an awful lot with doing this. And really the whole string of relations across the Delaware in the industry between Pennsylvania and New Jersey is really an untold story. So somebody needs to take that on a little bit more. So I'll be happy to answer questions. I don't think that the folks online could actually see me over this. I'm a lot shorter than Joe, but anyway, I'd be happy to answer any questions or hear any comments too, because I rely on learning a lot when I do this. Yes, sir. There is, yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, the question is, are there any pictures of the cable ferry that brought the boats across the Delaware from Easton to Phillipsburg and vice versa? There is one. It is in Delaware Canal Journal by C.P. Yoder. And actually, another one of the, no, it's a Schisler picture, a Dick Schisler picture. Is a beautiful image of that. I should have brought that because we also have that in the exhibit. Courtesy of Warren County, because Jim Lee Sr. commissioned this gentleman who actually was a foundryman at Ingersoll Rand named Dick Schisler. He was a self-taught artist. The amazing thing is that he was a wonderful colorist, but he was colorblind. And he worked from black and white photographs that Jim Lee, handed to him. Some of them are out of his own imagination, but most of them are historic photographs of the Morris. And they are also just a remarkable rendering in color too. So there was the one. And the cable ferry, I'm not quite sure how it was let out from side to side, but in the picture, there is a smaller sort of boat that's attached to the cable, and it's along the downstream side of the Morris boat as it's coming across. Yeah, Bill, do you know how it?
A couple of good photos and illustrations of the cable ferry between Lambertville and Hope that are in my Delaware Canal book.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Do you know, I once had a look at a book, my brother, who's in the rail business kind of, there's a collection of pictures of the Lehigh Valley Railroad which is mostly stations and empty track. But there's this incredible collection of pictures of the incline at the entrance in Phillipsburg, and it shows these guys in white shirts hauling the boats into where they could get into the crib. And of course, the thing that I get asked a lot too is, how did they get the mules across? They walked across the bridge. Okay, that's the easy answer, but with nothing to document it, you know. I think. No, it's not that one. It's another one. Yeah, it's published by Rising Sun Press, though. I have to get a copy of it because just if only for the pictures of the entrance of the Morris. The rest of it, frankly, I mean, I'm not a rail buff, so old train stations kind of don't get me, but yeah. Yes.
Glendon Ironworks, did it ever have rail access? It was basically on an island between the canal and the river. Lehigh Valley was on the land side of the canal. You know, was there ever a time when they had?
Well, yeah, they did to a point. They had a narrow gauge that hauled slag down to the lower end of the island. And apparently, and there is a picture of a trestle. So there must have been across the canal, kind of at an angle. So they must have had some way to get onto a siding on the valley and then maybe offload. I've never seen, however, like a loading kind of structure with it. But yeah, they did have a rail access to the Lehigh Valley tracks. But you know, they also closed up in 1893. So they were one of the earlier of the big ironworks. They were the earliest failure. But yeah, that's it's hard to believe now when you go to Humor Park that was once a big slag dump. You start digging a little bit and you find out it still is. Yes, ma'am.
My question originally was going to be how they got the canal boats across the river.
Ah, well,
So now, to get to the rapids,
a cable ferry.
how did that system work?
Well, see, this is what we were just saying. Whether there's I've never read a description, and now Bill is saying that it could have worked the same way the one did in Lambertville, but I've never read a description of how that worked. They were let down to the level of the river, you know, through a lock on the Pennsylvania side, but someplace there they got attached to this cable and then hauled across.
Typically on a cable ferry, they would line the boat up against the current. And they wanted to go down, of course, they would line it one way. If they wanted to go the other way, they would line it the other way.
The other way.
The boat would power itself across using the current.
Using the,
But the current varies, right?
yeah. Mhm.
So downstream.
Downstream was probably a pretty easy shot. It was the coming back across.
Cable and then the current pushed it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. And I've never read, of course, you don't read an awful lot about canal boat accidents, but I've never read about an accident crossing the Delaware either. But again, I mean, it's another one of those great history unknown questions that nobody ever seems to have written down at the time. So anybody else?
Yeah. Can you go back to your famous painting, the first view?
Oh, yeah. I'll have to get Jeff to do. Can you go back to or can we do it here? Yeah. Mhm.
Just point out where you said the Morris Canal was.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the Morris, oh, come on. I just discovered this thing in my desk drawer and there it is. Here's the Morris.
Yeah.
The entrance was there underneath basically underneath the Lehigh Valley trestle. And here's the Morris.
Where's the Bell Railroad?
That's a good question. It's right alongside, isn't it? It's right alongside. Is it between? It's between the river and the canal.
Because the Morris Canal was at a higher level than the railroad and more inland.
Yeah, it turned, I think, just below here. You know, because I mean, this is basically, you know, South Main Street now. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. It is a bit. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, you know, there was an exhibit of Grunewald stuff in the Allentown Art Museum all the way back in 1980. And the curator of the Allentown Art Museum at the time wrote a lot about Grunewald's background and training. And he was trained in Germany in the 18 teens and 20s in what was known as the German Romantic School, which had a big element of spirituality and sort of mysticism to it. And it's pointed out in a lot of his landscapes of the Bethlehem area, because he was in Bethlehem, of course, that had he stayed in Germany, none of this modern technology would have ever appeared. Because when the Germans painted a landscape, if there was something there, like a bridge or a train track or something like that, they would leave it out. Fortunately for us, because again, this is another, you know, beautiful representation before photography of what things looked like. But I mean, at first I was just really sort of taken by the fact that it's beautiful, and then I really started to look at it. So, okay.
Yes. The question is, what's the source of the limestone for?
What was the source of the limestone? That is something that is mentioned quite a bit, and only kind of like, but oh yes, it was brought by wagon. I would imagine that if the highlands of New Jersey are similar geologically to Pennsylvania, there's a lot of limestone everywhere. Yeah, and yeah, because the limestone was abundant, and it was one of those things that was very seldom carried by canal too, on the Pennsylvania side as well, brought in by wagon. Yeah. Did they? Oh. Oh, right. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Oh, uh-huh. Right. Yeah. 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 The when you come to the Hubor Park, when you come across the bridge, it is sitting on pilings that were constructed by Glendon Iron sometime presumably after the flood of 1862, although we don't know that for sure. That was a narrow gauge railroad in a covered bridge that came from the quarry that 25th Street comes down through, and brought the limestone across the Lehigh into the furnace there. Yeah, as a matter of fact, it is. Yeah, yeah, and oh dear, we have problems with that bridge. So yeah, I do worry about that, if it maybe even is a pre-1862 set of pillars, because that would suggest that they've been through a lot of floods. Anything else? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone.
Martha, that was absolutely wonderful. there are so many stories, and the stories go on and on and on. It was very interesting to hear from the Pennsylvania side coming back to us.
Right. By the way, most of you are probably familiar with this, and this is what I'm saying somebody needs to do on the Jersey side. Anthracite iron industry in the Lehigh Valley is the only really good description of the anthracite iron industry. It was written in the late 70s, I think. Okay. It was published in 1988 by Canal History and Technology Press, and it was written by the late Craig Bartholomew and the late Lance Metz. It did go into a couple of the New Jersey furnaces as well. It's out of print, but it turns up a lot on things like Amazon and eBay. Don't pay more than $25 for it, but it's called The Anthracite Iron Industry of the Lehigh Valley by Bartholomew and Metz. And it's really the best collection of accounts of the various furnaces. So
buy those books when they come along. Marvelous book. So many stories. Interested to hear you talk about our stories and hear your stories. There were so many things that you said that I had things to say about, but of course there's no time to say them all now. You mentioned the iron industry in Bhutan. We're working big time with Bhutan right now and trying to save some of the remains that are left. We will send you the good pictures of the furnace number 1 and furnace number 2, and you'll be gratified to know that the Bosch from furnace number 1 is still extant. All kinds of cool things.
I happened to run across the mention on your website that you let him walk there, and I thought, okay, I'm just going to let Joe talk.
And I would love to write that book, but full time in my spare time we're doing, canals. But yes.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, hurry up if anybody else wants to
Yes.
go, because the museum closes on the, I think, 19th of December. We're only open weekends right now from 11 to 3 or 3:30. And so Saturday and Sunday, and we're only going to be open until the weekend before Christmas. And then that exhibit's actually been up for 2 years, but it was the 50th anniversary of the museum. So it was the 2020 exhibit, but we only were open for 10 weeks in 2020. So over the winter, I started to call everybody, because a lot of that is on loan. Very little of that belongs to the Canal Museum. And I called everybody that we borrowed stuff from, and I said, would you be okay lending it for another year? And everyone said yes. And then I went to my boss and the board and I said, all the lenders say we can keep the art for another year. So it meant that I wasn't trying to put together another exhibit during the pandemic. And so we got 2 years out of it. So yes, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it, because it was really fun to do. And it was really amazing what I could find and what we were able to borrow. So.
Thank you. We thank you very much. You and I need to be on speed dial. We have so many stories to share.
Yes. I know. I'm going to go back to work on the 1st of December and dig out Ross Yates's biography of Joseph Warton.
One more thing I need to do. I need to thank Pat Zimmerman for being our go-between and getting this wonderful location for our meetings. We're here 2 in a row. I think many of the folks here are liking this location. So we're not sure where we'll find an in-person home next year, because the Park Commission is rather at odds with itself at the moment. So Pat, thank you. And so we're going to be carrying on. Thank you. Yes. And thank you again, Martha. And thank you all for coming. Remember when Bobby calls you to volunteer, you folks online, you folks here, we need more volunteers for our programming next year. We'll be having a schedule of events published in our January newsletter. We wish you all happy holidays, and we hope to see you again in January. Thank you.
All right.